Hey guys, this is just a quick video going through the highlights of these court cases. Okay, so just a reminder if you need a quick refresher on the expectation for your homework, both of those copies of those court cases, the Tinker versus Des Moines and the New York Times versus United States, I need you to bring those copies back annotated and then on a piece of notebook paper. State the facts with each of those cases. So based on the reading, find out the background of that case, like why did this case end up before the Supreme Court, as well as the ruling by the United States Supreme Court here. Okay? Which again, those handouts will tell you everything, but I just want to do a quick review, okay? Or kind of like a crash course, if you will, over these. I'm going to take that off real quick. Off the clock now. So, Tinker versus Des Moines, okay? This is one of the most significant cases in the history of the Supreme Court concerning students, okay? And whether or not students have a right to free speech at school. So as you can see, okay, this happened during the Vietnam War, and this was what it was over, okay? These students wore these black armbands to school, the Tinkers did. And in Des Moines, Iowa, okay, that's where this happened. The school board had just passed a policy stating that there could be no protest at school at all concerning the war. They just wanted to avoid that. And you look at the year 1965, the United States has just gotten involved, has just become involved in Vietnam. Okay, so the students wear these armbands to protest the war, and it's got the peace symbol on it. Okay, students get suspended because obviously they broke the policy about no protest. Okay. But think about it. I mean, this was not a vocal protest, right? This was a silent protest. They just wore an armband to show that they were for peace and not for us being involved in the Vietnam War. And what the Supreme Court said is this. Supreme Court said that students do have a right to freedom of speech at school, okay? That can never be taken away from you. And the famous ruling by the court by Justice Abe Fortas says this: it can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed. Now, what does shed mean? Well, those of you who have a dog, and I have a golden retriever puppy right now, so I really know that. Shed means lose, right? If a dog's shedding, they're losing their hair. So shed means lose. It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed or lose their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, at the door. In other words, you do not lose your First Amendment rights the second that you walk into school. That's not a thing. You keep your First Amendment rights whenever you walk into the building. However, okay, so students do have the right to freedom of speech at school, but what the precedent that the Supreme Court established in this case was that the school has the right to limit your speech if it is harmful to other students or it disrupts the learning environment. As you know, learning, education, teaching, that is the main goal or objective of a school. So the Supreme Court said students do have a right to free speech, but it can be limited if it interferes with the main objective of a school, which is to be a place of learning. Okay? So what speech or actions could be limited at school? You know, you can't stand up and yell in the middle of class. That would not be acceptable. You cannot talk constantly, you know, if the lesson's trying to go on. You cannot say words that might be harmful to other students, like slurs or anything like that. Okay, the list goes on and on and on. Okay. Now, the Pentagon Papers. Okay, we talked about this a little bit in class when we talked about Watergate. Okay. But first, I want to talk about what the Pentagon Papers were. So, you see right here, Vietnam Archive, a Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So, we're pivoting from the Tinker versus Des Moines case to the New York Times versus United States case, because this concerned the Pentagon Papers. And what the Pentagon Papers were was this guy that worked for the Defense Department, Daniel Ellsberg. He leaked copies of this report to both the New York Times and the Washington Post. They both received copies of this. And the documents showed that the United States government had lied about our involvement in Vietnam. You know, had been exaggerating the death toll on the Vietnamese side, had been downplaying the amount of casualties that the American forces were suffering. But the big smoking gun, okay, in this was that some of the evidence showed that the plans were being made for the U.S. to go into Vietnam even before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was, as you recall, when North Vietnam attacked two of our destroyers off the Gulf of Tonkin. So this is big, okay? Because already the American people know that the government's been lying about Vietnam a little bit because of the Tet Offensive, right? That's when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacked all those villages in South Vietnam at once when the American government had been saying we were winning. So they knew there was some deception going on, but this was like the proof in the pudding. Now, the government does not want this out there, okay? The government does not want this out there. And so the government, the Attorney General specifically, gets involved. And they asked the newspapers to stop printing the Pentagon Papers on the grounds of national security. Because, I mean, it was a copy from the Pentagon, of a report from the Pentagon. Okay? So a judge in New York, a federal judge, does grant them an injunction, does grant the government an injunction to stop printing the papers. Okay? And so this is the first time in U.S. history, really, that this has ever happened, or this is known as prior restraint, where the government suppresses the press or speech before it gets out. And so this was a loaded situation because, I mean, it's like, are we living in a dictatorship, like where, the First Amendment is limited? Because the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they're going to decide on this. Should these newspapers be allowed to print the Pentagon Papers, the details of this document showing how the American government had lied about Vietnam? And what the Supreme Court ruled was this. They said that government censorship, okay, or the government limiting, the media and controlling what's involved, they said in this case it was not justified. There was no national security concern, okay? And ultimately, the press helped being a watchdog on government officials and letting the American people know if there is deception was more important. Ultimately, they said that that's what the founders would have wanted. The founders would have wanted these journalists to expose the U.S. government in this case. So the injunctions were lifted, and the newspapers were allowed to print the Pentagon Papers. Which, what do you think happened to the number of anti-war protesters after this? Through the absolute roof after this. Okay? So again, the number of anti-war protesters increased as a result of the Supreme Court's ruling and the Pentagon Papers starting to come to light. Okay, and that's it. Just wanted to give a quick rundown of that, seeing as that will be on your final. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and have a great rest of your day.